Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today's introduction session, Measurement and Disclosure 101. My name is Julia Silberman. I'm the Associate Director of Corporate Engagement at CDP North America, and I'm thrilled to be joined by David Rich, who's a Senior Associate of the Climate Program at WRI. Today, we're going to use the next 45 minutes or so to talk about these two key fundamental aspects of environmental management and reporting, and how they link to the larger themes of today's conference around net zero. This is meant to be a interactive session for the next 45 minutes. So David and I will go through some information and slides, but we really encourage you to enter questions into the Q&A function, which you will see on the screen on the right-hand side, and we will be very happy to address them throughout, and also we'll make sure to save plenty of time at the end for questions and to make this a little bit conversational so it's most useful for you. So today we're going to go through these areas. We're going to talk about measurement and disclosure, why we're having this intro session, how it links to the larger themes of today's conference, and why this is such an important topic given this larger theme that we're all striving towards around net zero emissions. Then David will provide an introduction to the GHG protocol, what it is, how it works, some fundamentals of carbon accounting for those of you who are just getting started with that process for your companies. Then I'll provide a brief overview of reporting and CDP and the role that we play in this ESG disclosure space. And then finally, we'll talk a little bit about how these two aspects of environmental management lend themselves to your company's progression along your own environmental journey, and how it connects to larger questions around ambitious emissions reduction target setting and net zero. So let me start with a brief introduction, just so we're all on the same page in terms of some of the key organizations and standards that we're talking about today. So these are some of the topic areas we're going to cover. David is going to provide an in-depth overview of the GHG protocol, greenhouse gas protocol, which is a global standard of carbon accounting that companies align to in terms of calculating their carbon emissions footprints. And then they take that information and report it through CDP and many other reporting standards. CDP, we are a global environmental nonprofit through which companies, cities, states, and regions disclose on their environmental management to their stakeholders. And we are fully aligned with the GHG protocol and encourage companies to leverage that tool when going through their own internal calculations to support their reporting. And both of these initiatives are well aligned with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which I'm sure many of you are very familiar with at this point, which is a coalition of 4 different nonprofits, including CDP and WRI, which produces the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which sets the methodology for how companies can set emissions reductions targets that are in line with climate science. Currently, they have set these standards for companies to set science-based targets in a medium time frame, sort of 5 to 15 year time frame, but are now also working on the net zero standard, which will inform companies' net zero targets looking into the future. So why are we having this session on measurement disclosure? Why is this such a fundamental part of this larger theme? Well, you'll hear this from us many times, and I'm sure you've heard this from many others, that what gets measured gets managed. By going through the process of calculating your emissions footprint, you are able to evaluate, the biggest impacts of your business, understand your business intimately, find areas for efficiency or transformative change to manage your impact. Emissions accounting is a prerequisite to some of the more ambitious target setting and environmental action that have become the gold standards for companies around the world. And so it's a fundamental step and an ongoing process to support some of these more ambitious actions. Reporting provides a standardized and comparable set of data to evaluate, not only to evaluate performance, and this is valuable both for you, but also for your stakeholders as they make business decisions based on the companies that they are either investing in or purchasing from. Transparency is a fundamental part of this process. Then this is why reporting is so important as an ongoing annual process to update your key stakeholders on your performance, but also as a tool for you to integrate best practices into your own environmental management, going through the process each year of calculating your emissions footprint, disclosing on this, and answering standard sets of questions is a fantastic tool to bring important conversations into your business about what are those next actions for your company and being able to progress these initiatives further. So with that sort of baseline setting, standard setting of why we're all here today, I'm going to hand it over to David, who is going to talk in a little bit more detail about the GHG protocol and what this all really looks like.
Thanks so much, Julia, and thank you all for joining us today for this session. I'm with the Greenhouse Gas Protocol at WRI, and I'll tell you a little bit about it and some basic concepts. Next, please. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, it's a joint project of the World Resources Institute and WBCSD, going back 20 years. We set the global standard for how to measure and manage greenhouse gas emissions through the greenhouse gas accounting standards that we develop through global multi-stakeholder development processes. We provide standards. Our largest audience is business and organizations doing their corporate or organizational greenhouse gas inventory. We also have standards and guidance for cities and government users as well. We have sector level guidance for different industry sectors that goes beyond the kind of general standards and provides some industry specific measurement guidance. We have calculation tools, Excel tools where you can input data and calculate emissions. We also provide emission factors on our website, and we have online training resources that you can use if that would be helpful to you. All of this is online at ghgprotocol.org, and it's all free, and we encourage everyone to use it. So next slide, please. We see, as Julia was already saying, we see greenhouse gas measurement as a foundation for climate action planning. So by doing your greenhouse gas inventory as a first step, you can understand what your emissions are, where your main emissions hotspots are, where your biggest mitigation opportunities are, to prioritize where to invest your energy in reducing emissions, and as a basis for tracking progress over time to make sure you're moving in the right direction. So with the greenhouse gas inventory, you identify actions, set targets in line with science-based targets to the extent possible, plan, an action plan, implementation of activities, and then you report and track progress on an annual basis, ideally reporting to CDP and as part of that process. So we see this as a cycle, and where these initiatives that Julia outlined are all complementary and fit together in this kind of a climate action cycle. Next, please. So through the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we have multiple standards and guidance, but two that I want to focus on today, which are the most kind of core standards for company or organizational level. Inventories are the corporate standard on the left side and the Scope 3 standard on the right side, which I'll just share a little bit about in the next couple slides. Next, please. So one key feature of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol is that we we organize a company's emissions into scopes, 3 scopes. A company's direct emissions are Scope 1 emissions. These are from company-owned or controlled activities, which may include facilities, buildings, vehicles, or any other operations that are owned or controlled by the company. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from purchased electricity, primarily. So these occur somewhere else, but they're related to the company's activities in the sense that they're tied to your electric consumption. And Scope 3 emissions are all other indirect emissions that occur in the value chain of the company, both upstream and downstream. The Scope 3 standard organizes Scope 3 emissions into 15 categories, which are outlined here on the screen. Some of these are upstream, which include purchased goods and services, meaning the production of products that your company consumes or produces. Waste disposal, business travel, employee commuting, leased assets are a few examples. Downstream are categories such as use of sold products. So this is the consumer use phase of the products that the company produces and sells, the end-of-life treatment of those products, and then leased assets, franchises, or investments, which may show up in your Scope 1 boundary or your Scope 3 boundary, depending on how you define your organizational boundary, which I'll come to in just one second. And one more point to highlight on this diagram is that at the top, you can see the 7 greenhouse gases that are required to be reported in your inventory to the extent that they occur in your operations or value chain. So these are emitted from different types of sources. CO2 being, obviously from fossil fuel combustion, very important gas. Some methane and N2O sources are more from agriculture or oil and gas production or landfills. HFCs and PFCs are refrigeration and air conditioning. So these different gases are tied to different sources of emissions you might have as a company. Next, please. So one kind of important step when you're developing your greenhouse gas inventory is to set your organizational boundary. And there's a couple options for doing so. This basically determines which operations fall within your direct Scope 1 boundary. So these might be which business units, subsidiaries, facilities, leased assets, investments, etc. It depends on how complex of an organization you have. Some corporations, it's very complicated. Some smaller entities, this won't be as much of a concern. But basically, you can define this based on ownership or control. And again, some companies, you may own and control everything, and therefore there's not much of an issue here. But many sectors and many companies, they own certain things but don't control them. And on the flip side, they control things but don't own them. A simple example being you might have office space that you're the tenant, but you don't own the building, or the reverse is you're the landlord and you own it, but you don't operate the space. So you have to choose which basis to define your organizational boundary. And this defines what goes in your Scope 1 basically, and how you do the accounting for those emissions. So that's just a quick overview, but there's more information in the standards if you're more interested in that topic. And one more kind of technical topic that I wanted to mention is just how do you go about calculating your emissions? In some cases, you could directly monitor the emissions that are coming out of a smokestack or other source. But in many cases, companies use this very simple equation to calculate their emissions, which is activity data times emission factor equals emissions. So just a simple example of activity data might be how much gasoline do you consume in a period of time for transportation. So in some period of time, you might consume 1,000 gallons of gasoline. Then you need to basically know how to convert that to emissions. You need to look up an emission factor. We provide these on our website, or if you're in the US EPA provides them. So there's different sources. But you might find that for gasoline, the emission factor is 8.8 kilograms of CO2 emitted for every gallon of gasoline that's combusted. And by using this simple equation, you can then figure out that your 1,000 gallons of gasoline has led to 8.8 tons of CO2 being emitted. And you repeat that process for all your other fuels and other activities that you have in your inventory. And then the next, if we click one more, if you have emissions of gases other than CO2, which were mentioned on a couple slides ago, you'll have to convert those to carbon dioxide equivalent. And this simple equation, again, can do that for you. So you figure out what your emissions are by gas by following the previous equation. You might figure out you have 100 tons of methane that you emit in your company. And to put that on a kind of level playing field with CO2, to compare the two, you apply a global warming potential value, which you can also find on our website. These are provided by the IPCC. Their most recent report says that methane has a global warming potential of 28, which means methane per ton is 28 times more potent than CO2 using this particular method. And that tells you that methane emissions in units of CO2 equivalent are 2,800 tons of CO2e, which you can then use to compare to your emissions of CO2 and figure out, where to prioritize your efforts and so on. So that's just a little taste of what we provide in our standards and guidance. For more information, next slide, please. As I said, just feel free to go to the website here, which provides all these other resources, further detailed guidance, standards, tools, emission factors, etc., for more in-depth information. And And then one last slide is just to let you know that we're developing some new guidance right now for land sector activities and CO2 removals and how those should be included in companies' greenhouse gas inventories. These are currently not very widely included in inventories, partly due to a lack of agreed guidance on how to handle these issues, some of which we found are very complex. And so we're aiming to provide new guidance on these topics in the next year or so, with some interim steps along the way in terms of review drafts and so on. And if you have any interest in participating, you can look to this link here and get involved in the process. And with that, I will hand back over to Julia. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. Lots of great information. I think that there's likely many questions from companies who are going through this process or going through it for again this year as they calculate their previous year's emissions. So feel free to drop your questions in the chat, either about any of the basics around GHG accounting, around the work that GHG protocol does, or about future developments in this space, and we'd be happy to address those at the end. So now I'm going to provide a just brief overview of CDP and how the work that we do aligns with the work that David was just describing, and then we'll talk a little bit about what this all means and how this lends itself to your company's own environmental journey. So what is CDP? We are a global environmental nonprofit through which companies, cities, states, and regions disclose on their environmental performance to their stakeholders. And by virtue of this, we have the most comprehensive collection of self-reported data on companies' climate change, water, and deforestation impacts in the world. And then this data is used by policymakers, investors, purchasers to inform their decision-making and enable them to achieve their own environmental goals and financial goals. So let me give you some quick numbers to talk about the scale, and I will mention sort of based on the timeline of when I'm talking to you, these numbers are about to be updated in the next few months. But in 2020, or this year rather, 2021, 590 plus institutional investors with $110 trillion in assets are requesting environmental data from the largest companies in the world through CDP. We are also working with 155 plus major purchasers who are requesting data from companies in their supply chains to partner with them to both understand their supply chain impact, their scope 3 footprint, as David was alluding to, but also to engage with them to drive environmental performance improvement. In 2020, 9,600 companies disclosed through CDP around the world, including 75% of the S&P 500 and 800 plus cities. So this is a widespread initiative at this point, and with a lot of companies globally represented and participating in the annual disclosure process. So what does this really look like? Well, investors and customers, those groups that I just mentioned, are requesting companies in their portfolios and supply chains to disclose to one of CDP's 3 questionnaires: climate change, water, or deforestation. And of course, for our purposes today, we'll talk about climate. Companies are leveraging the disclosure process to evaluate their own environmental performance, take steps to integrate best practices into their environmental management, including calculating their emissions footprint according to in line with the GHG protocol, and then communicating that information back to their stakeholders to provide transparency to this group. Investors and customers are using the data, as I mentioned, to make business decisions about their investments and purchasing. So in this way, by going through the cycle each year, companies are able to take the next step annually in their own internal processes, and investors and customers can improve the data and decision making that they're making, and this lends itself to a sort of positive cycle of environmental performance improvement around the world. So once the data is provided back to CDP, this really informs the ESG system. So it goes to individual investors. It also goes into Bloomberg terminals, and so that there's more access for a broader range of actors to leverage this data for their purposes. It goes to investor research firms, and then it's also integrated into different products and indices. So it's really at the heart of this way to unlock environmental data and make it useful to the financial system. So I mentioned that CDP companies report through 3 different questionnaires, and here you can see a high-level overview of the questionnaires. They ask for both qualitative and quantitative information on companies' environmental performance. They ask companies to go through an in-depth risk assessment of their impacts from and to these different issue areas. And a couple things that I just want to flag for you here, given the topic that we're discussing today. The first is, of course, that we're fully aligned with the GHG protocol, and companies are providing a high level of in-depth quantitative information on their environmental footprint across Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. I'll also flag that we are fully aligned with the TCFD, so the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which is a high-level task force that sits underneath the G20, underneath the Financial Stability Board, and has set out a series of recommendations on how companies should be reporting on their climate change impacts, in line with what is required for investment decision making. So reporting to CDP enables you to produce this TCFD aligned data set that then gets immediately, that then gets translated for financial markets and to institutional investors. And happy to talk a little bit more about that if there are questions on this. The last piece that I'll mention in terms of the climate change questionnaire, just because it sort of lends itself to this next piece that we want to discuss, is that we also ask for in-depth information on companies' emissions reduction targets, including whether or not they have science-based targets and the level of ambition of their science-based targets. And for the first time now, also asking specifically about net zero targets. So, by virtue of having this standardized comparable data set, which goes out to this wide range of companies around the world, we're able to not only help communicate these best practices that many of you are undertaking and working on within your own organizations, but also be able to produce this standardized set of data around company action on each of these topic areas. So that was just a whirlwind overview of CDP and environmental reporting, and happy to talk more about any of those areas. We want to spend a few minutes talking about, why are we really focused so much on emissions accounting, on reporting, and how does it lend itself to some of these larger picture items, such as setting ambitious emissions reduction targets. So environmental management, as you all know, is a long-term, it's a journey, and it's over the long term. But when companies first get started on environmental disclosure, on calculating their footprints, they sometimes start with partial information, with what they have available, and then over time are able to take more ambitious action across each of the different areas of importance to company. So on the slide, you can see a sort of high-level representative example of what it might look like for a company to progress along this trajectory towards leadership, from partial disclosure all the way up to having best practices embedded, such as board-level oversight of climate issues, validated science-based targets, reducing emissions year over year, having in-depth risk assessments, etc. But this idea of a journey towards best practice, what I'm showing you here is sort of across the entire body of what a company's environmental management on climate might look like. But this exists within each of the sort of core areas of a company's environmental performance as well. So, for example, when we talk about calculating your emissions footprint, there is a journey within this as well, starting with partial emissions data, then maybe focusing on your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, your operational emissions for which you have data more readily available, is within your control to immediately begin to measure and manage. Then maybe the next step is verifying your emissions, so getting some third-party validation of the way that you are going through this calculation process, and then all the way up to having year-over-year reductions, and taking some specific actions to reduce your emissions year-over-year. So as you sort of progress along this pathway of producing a complete emissions inventory, for many companies, the next step, or a step that they do in parallel, is to consider setting a science-based target. And so, as I mentioned at the top of this presentation, a science-based target is an emissions reduction target that is consistent with the level of decarbonization required to keep global temperature increase well below 2 degrees Celsius. And the science-based targets validated by an organization called the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a coalition of 4 different nonprofits that you can see on the screen here. And what they do is set up the methodology so that each company can account for the portion of emissions that is required for them to, meet their sort of fair share of emissions reductions to achieve this global goal. And so what this chart that you're seeing here shows is that science-based targets are a sort of medium-term, very ambitious target in line with 1.5 C degrees of what a company has to do to, reduce emissions, and that will put them in line with a net zero target by 2050, which is, the long-term goal that we're all working towards. So the Science-Based Targets Initiative is currently in the process of developing and having consultations on net zero emissions, net zero guidance, which will build on the work that they have done of validating science-based targets. And then the last piece that I'll mention here is, hopefully it's clear at this point that the carbon accounting piece is vital for setting and tracking progress against these meaningful targets, but that also annual disclosure is a requirement of, showing your progress as you against these targets that you set. So the last thing that I will mention is, if your company is looking to set your own science-based target, which is the highest priority for companies around the world to take some meaningful action to reduce their impact, this is what the process looks like. So it is you get started by committing to set a science-based target. You then have 2 years to develop and have your target validated by the SBTi, and then announce your targets once they've been approved. So very happy to answer questions on this about CDP, about reporting generally, yeah, happy to open it up for a little bit of a discussion since we've just ran through a lot of information, and take any of your questions to help your company take the next steps in your environmental journey. Thank you.
Great. I can moderate the Q&A. Thanks for those that have put in questions. There were a few that came in at the end of my session, which I'll get to, but maybe I'll just ask Julia the one question that's come in so far on CDP. How are you verifying that data collected is accurate?
Yeah, it's a great question. So, and I also promised that I would mention the timeline, which I realized I forgot, so I will mention that as well. So what CDP has a scoring methodology where every company that submits has their response scored according to this, transparent and public scoring methodology. In there, we highly incentivize some best practices, such as verifying your emissions. So having a third party, review the emissions calculations that you've done, provide some assurance, and then report that back through CDP. So that's, one sort of way that we are verifying the emission that's provided. But beyond that, companies are reporting to stakeholders that are scrutinizing the data that they provide, such as their investors and their customers. So there's a high degree of incentive just by virtue of where the data is going to provide accurate data. There's also incentives for high-level review within companies of the information being collected. It's very common for this information to go through legal reviews in companies. So some of those are sort of ways that companies are building some further credibility around the information they're providing. The last thing is that, of course, we have a huge number of companies participating in this standardized and comparable process, and so there's the ability to benchmark and review peers in parallel to each other. So through all of those ways, it's really incentivizing accurate data. But it is voluntary, and it's meant as a tool for companies and for investors and for customers to better their own performance. So that is also a component of this as well.
I'll answer the few questions that came in after my session, and then we'll see if there are more on CDP and science-based targets. The first one that came in is, do you recommend using a 20-year or 100-year global warming potential as a standard? So under the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, we require the companies report according to the 100-year method at a minimum, but we recommend that you also consider whether also providing information based on 20 years is meaningful and relevant to your business. I think there are some who think that the 20-year time frame is very important to focus on short-term efforts and show impacts on a 20-year scale rather than 100-year scale. So that's an option left to companies, but at a minimum, we ask everyone uses 100-year for sort of comparability purposes. There were two questions which have a similar answer. One is, do you have any guidance on how to calculate suppliers' emission reductions? And second is, if you only have spend data for a specific category, can you apply an emission factor based on spend data? And I'll just say we have Scope 3 calculation guidance that might help answer these two questions. It sort of supplements the Scope 3 standard and gets into some more of the methods and data issues, which you can find on our website. And you can look under Category 1, Purchase Goods and Services, which might have some help on that. Basically, the spend method is listed as an option, but it's kind of ranked the least accurate method if you can get better data. But if spend data is the best you can do, then it explains how you can use spend-based data. And now I have to review the new questions that come in. One is on small and medium-sized businesses and what resources are available. So I imagine some of what Julia said about the environmental journey could help with that in terms of starting where you can and progressing from there. We have kind of very simple Excel calculators on our website, GHG Protocol website, which you can just plug in how much energy consumption you have from your electric bills or your fuel bills, natural gas bills, whatever you might have, and get going in terms of converting that to emissions. And I'll see if Julia wants to say anything more about other resources that might be available for small.
Yeah, I'll just add too that the Science-Based Targets Initiative has new methodology for small medium enterprises. So there is tailored guidance available for them if they're looking to set targets. And the other thing I would say is when it comes to reporting is focusing on a small subset of questions to get started with, those that are sort of most directly relevant to the stakeholders to whom they're reporting, and then they can build the level of completeness over time from there. So that's how I would recommend companies get started with that.
The most recent question is, does CDP prioritize any consumer or public awareness and education of emission results, or is that the responsibility more of reporting companies?
It's a great question. So I think primarily to this point, our audience has been sort of B2B, right? Sort of to financial markets, to customers. But I will say that, as this topic has gained more and more relevance and prominence just in society, we have seen quite a lot more attention just from the media in general about the work that we're doing and the performance of companies generally. So, certainly not out of the realm of possibility. We do also, of course, produce reports and blogs and to try to make our data accessible and show how companies are taking action. But primarily, I would say that the main audience to this point has been those requesting stakeholders and then the larger, data users that are taking advantage of the information that we collect.
And I don't know whether CDP has an answer about this, but what is an acceptable margin of error when performing Scope 1 and 2 emission calculations?
That's a great question, and I might have to consult our guidance if I'm being honest. But we do ask at different points. So, for example, in Scope 3 reporting, we do ask for like a confidence factor within that, and it's really about sort of providing transparency to what is being covered by the emissions calculations that you're providing. So, in each of the questions, there's like space for companies to provide additional context and explain to those that are using the data. We ask for a lot of information around, what is included and not included in your emissions calculations. And between all of that information that you're able to provide, the data users are able to get a reasonable understanding of your footprint. I will also say that, it is acceptable to estimate emissions to some extent if, for example, the timelines are not matching up, et cetera. But again, like relying on the best data you have available and, providing as much transparency as possible through the disclosure process.
Great. I guess I'll just add on that one. I think if your sources of emissions are mainly energy related, then the level of uncertainty is probably not very high, assuming that the activity data you're using is good, because there's not a lot of uncertainty with regard to the emission factors that are used for that. Whereas we're doing some new land sector work where the kind of levels of uncertainty are sort of orders of magnitude higher than what is typical in the energy sector. So that's just another dimension there, is your sector might affect that question as well. Someone's asked about, will the video and slide deck be shared? And I think it will. I believe it will. I don't know when or how, but I think it will.
I do see a question about, like, my understanding is it's not a requirement for companies and should it be mandatory? And so, the answer is, reporting at the moment is voluntary. It's a best practice and there's a lot of, attention to companies' participation in disclosure, both through CDP, but also through other avenues. I think that we are seeing a lot of conversation right now about mandatory reporting, including sort of at the federal level. So it's possible in the future, and it's certainly something that CDP has been promoting and encouraging for a long time. I think there will always be a need for action beyond sort of what's required from a mandatory perspective, as we sort of think about what is next, what's best practice, what's the level of detail that stakeholders need to make good decisions. But certainly exciting to see that there is a lot of momentum in this area, though who knows how it will materialize.
There's a question about hourly versus annual emission factors for Scope 2. We've just sort of seen more attention given to this hourly issue just recently. I think, annual emission factors is the norm. So I feel like based on what we're seeing lately, there might be a new work done on hourly emission factors and a new movement in that direction. But maybe a little too early to tell, at least from our point of view. I don't know if Julia's had any insight into that.
I think that's as much as I can add on that. Yeah, it's a challenge for sure. Great. I see a request to go back to the investor slide, which I'm happy to do. And I'll just add that this is a small summary of the ways that data is being used by the sort of global marketplace. But essentially there's the sort of categories that I would point out here are sort of investor research, goes into specific indices and funds that want to, make investments in companies that are, taking ambitious climate action, and then also to into individual investment firms for their own purposes. CDP also does our best to align with other standards. So, for example, DJSI is aligned to CDP's climate emissions questions, I think. So, there's anyway, just a snapshot of how some of this information gets put into the marketplace. And now say this is like an investment snapshot, but this is only one category of data users that are leveraging this information, and certainly sort of extends beyond that in terms of how the information companies are providing is used. How do businesses go from measuring best we can to having very accurate data? Is this something you want to speak to, David?
Well, I think it's back to the journey. I mean, you start with the best you can, but yes, ideally, everyone will get to better data soon. We sort of think some data is better than no data, but really, if the data is not accurate, you could say it has somewhat limited value because you have to make sure it's accurate information. So, well, it's a good question. I think it comes to the journey and starting somewhere, but then progressing and getting more accurate data as you go.
Yeah. Yeah, I think companies, that are sort of fully embedding the process of GHG accounting. What I've seen from companies who are sort of going through this journey is, it starts as sort of a few people within the organization who are collecting data the best they can to being like fully integrated into the operations of a company, and just part of sort of the normal sort of data collection and reporting processes that all get sort of fed up to those who are translating the activity data into the carbon emissions and then going through this annual verification process as well. So yeah, absolutely. There's it's valuable at every stage, but I think the goal is to just make this sort of a normal embedded part of a company's annual operating plan. I have a question that I see here on remote work. So how should companies be accounting for remote work over the last few years? And, happy for David to contribute to this. I don't know if there's been new guidance come out, but it's I think something that we certainly have seen a lot of companies shifting to, and it just changes the inputs to your emissions calculation, right? So if you're using less office space, but instead, employees are commuting less, then that doesn't go into your scope 3 footprint. So it just changes the inputs to your calculation, and can affect your overall emissions for your company based on that. I don't know if you have anything else to add on this topic.
Well, we would recommend it. The employee commuting category in Scope 3 does include telecommuting or remote work as an activity within that category. So, yeah, we would recommend companies accounting for this. We ourselves haven't provided detailed guidance. We have gotten some questions about that. We don't have kind of a how-to guide, but we would encourage remote work being included given the circumstances these days.
Great. I see the question, does CDP primarily collect data surrounding full companies' GHG accounting, or is GHG data of specific products reported in the form of LCAs or EPDs? So CDP incentivizes corporate-wide emissions accounting. There is some product level data that you could provide, but the vast majority of what we're collecting and incentivizing is corporate-wide carbon accounting, but with a high degree of granularity in the information that's being provided.
And
great.
I can take the.
Go ahead. Yes, please.
One quick one on this glove example. The way the Scope 3 accounting works is that yes, the multiple companies in the value chain would account for the Scope 3 impact in their own inventory. So if you have some improvement, the manufacturer counts a Scope 3 improvement, and then the distributor could do the same. As long as they're accounted for in Scope 3, then it's a kind of acceptable form of double counting, if you want to call it that.
Yeah, Scope 3 is very frequently about, where's your leverage to drive emissions reductions in your value chain. So, even though there is some inherent, question, double counting, it's incredibly valuable to have an accurate perspective of your Scope 3 footprint so that you can take action to use your leverage to reduce it. So, great. Well, I see that we are at the top of the hour, so I just want to say thank you so much for your time and for joining us today and for all of your questions and participating so fully. Really excited about the rest of this event, and I hope that you guys will take from this, some useful information to take back and to support your own carbon accounting or environmental reporting journey. Any final comments from you, David?
No, just thank you everybody for your participation. Really appreciate it.
Great. Hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.